Magic money is your money. Okay, so from now on, whenever you hear about a new initiative out of our federal government, no matter what benefits they propose to make the world a greener and more equitable place, a more just society, just remember, this is your money they're spending. Hello, Stormwall Nation, and welcome back to another episode on money and inflation. I'm Mike Wilkerson. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, including the latest one called "The Dollar's Batteries Are Running Low," where I talk about inflation, your purchasing power, and where this is all going, you should check it out. I'll include a link in the show notes below. But let's get on with this episode. So if you go no further in this video, just remember one thing: the most important question that you can ask in evaluating government spending, social benefit programs, whatever it might be. The question is, who pays? Now, in this case, we're talking about who pays for the various Biden administration programs, whether it be student debt forgiveness, the Green New Deal, inflation, support of Ukraine, the war with Russia, or pandemic relief payments. Well, it turns out the answer is always the same. You do. If you're a tax-paying citizen of the United States, you bear the cost of magic money. Now, we call it magic money because it had no substance and no existence before about a year or so ago. It wasn't generated through productive investment in the economy. It's been created by our government out of thin air by issuing debt that you and I will eventually have to repay, whether in the form of taxes or through inflation and debasement of the dollar. And more of both are coming our way. Now, for those of you who are still with me, you must have a high tolerance for pain in the form of bad news, because there's plenty of it on the money printing front, and this topic is a tough one. But in case you've lost track, here's just a short list of some of the big ticket items that our government has doled out in the last couple of years. So as mentioned on Ukraine, and the support of the defense of Ukraine, to date, the United States is committed to spend approximately $45 billion on Ukraine, of which over half, roughly $25 billion, has been in the form of military support. Now, that's an amount that's more than 3 times what the European Union has committed, which is about $12 billion to date. The disparity, notwithstanding the fact that the threat imposed by Russia and a widening war clearly sit in Europe's backyard, not in ours. The U.S. has once again been duped into playing the role of rich uncle in Europe, a long codependency that President Trump had broken just a few years ago. Ukraine has never been deemed to be of strategic interest for the U.S., yet suddenly it's become a top priority for the U.S. government. Now, whatever one feels about the war and the terrible suffering of the Ukrainian people, how can America justify this amount of spending given the serious economic challenges we're facing here at home? Now, the next one is student debt forgiveness. We've talked about this. While the Department of Education has been intentionally vague here, estimates are that the cost of this program will ultimately run somewhere between $300 billion and $500 billion. I recently wrote in the Epoch Times that this handout is a hidden tax on Americans, especially hurting the working and middle class. Not to mention it being extremely unfair to the millions of Americans who diligently paid off their student debt and now feel like chumps. The third item to talk about is the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is the trimmed down successor to the even more egregious Build Back Better Act, which stalled last year in the Senate at the end of 2021. The misnamed Inflation Reduction Act is expected to do little to reduce inflation, but rather succeed in lowering national income and lowering U.S. employment. Advocates of the plan expect it to generate additional revenue for the government through more rigorous income tax enforcement, where, for example, the IRS gets an additional $80 billion to investigate, audit, and pursue individual taxpayers, increase corporate taxes, and then imposing drug price restrictions on the pharma industry. And those caps may be a good thing in theory, but they may only have the effect of shifting those costs from government payers to private payers. In any event, here's the bad news. The act itself is expected to reduce long-term GDP by 0.2% and eliminate about 29,000 jobs in the U.S., while reducing income tax, after-tax incomes for taxpayers across every single income bracket, whether working class, middle class, or it doesn't matter. So effectively, it's just a shifting of wealth from private pocketbooks to the federal government. Next, the Infrastructure Act, which did make it into law last year, it authorizes $1.2 trillion of new spending. Now, $1 trillion is a lot of money. no matter how it's spent. But at least, if it were invested in infrastructure, it would be of long-term benefit to the country. Now, unfortunately, this is not the case. Very little of the spending will go to actual infrastructure. Less than 10% is going towards bridges, tunnels, and other major projects that you and I would think about when we hear infrastructure. And instead, it is touted as a big step to address the climate crisis. So we have that. But there's 450 billion of the 1.2 trillion marked for discretionary spending. Now, it's safe to assume this money is going to be wasted on political pork barrel projects, probably not invested in productive infrastructure. And that's a shame of it. So indeed, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, estimates that the program will increase the budget deficits by about just over $250 billion through 2031. And then, of course, pandemic relief, where we know the U.S. government has committed to spend $4.3 trillion to fund various programs related to COVID-19 response. Now, that's interesting, but of this amount, 3.2 trillion, roughly 3/4, went towards grants, subsidies, and contributions. So in other words, handouts that will never be repaid. And these gifts were not evenly distributed across Americans, but went to less than 15 million recipients. So for perspective, keep in mind the federal government revenue comprised of income taxes and other taxes totals just over 4 trillion annually itself, with deficit spending far exceeding that revenue. So we spent 1 year of total national revenue for the government on pandemic relief. Now, as a result of this generosity, the government has had to issue debt, tripling levels since the financial crisis to a level now more than 30 trillion. This list could go on and on, but I think the point's been made. So let me just move on to say, how's this happen? So the Biden administration has been hypnotized and enchanted by magicians who worship what is called modern monetary theory. So as I wrote in Why America Matters, proponents of MMT believe that the government can run deficits and rack up debt to support them in perpetuity, because government, as the monopoly issuer of the currency, can always print more money and raise taxes. So instead of pulling a rabbit out of the hat, traditional magician style, these economic magicians create dollars from thin air. They believe that they can just keep on issuing debt and printing more money without consequence. Now, this debt will eventually have to be repaid, either through economy-killing taxes or by debasing the dollar through severe and continued inflation. Recently released consumer price index figures show that inflation grew 8.3% in August, and inflation's been above 8% since March. So I believe that inflation is going to persistently run hot, with Americans' purchasing power being depleted until this magic money is revealed for what it is and the digital printing presses are stopped. In the meantime, Americans will continue to foot the bill, and that's the sad news in this whole thing. So magic money is your money. Don't ever forget it. I hope you enjoyed this episode in my series on inflation and money. If so, give it a like. Subscribe to the Stormwell channel on YouTube, turn on the notifications bell, share it, and sign up for the emails on stormwell.com, so you're always up to date on what we're doing. And if you haven't already done so, head over to whyamericamatters.com and pre-order my upcoming book, Why America Matters, coming out later this year. Great. We'll see you next time here on stormwell.com.